Okay, our final speaker is Arzu Merali, and she's from the Islamic Human Rights Commission.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I hope it's okay if I sit down and
sure.
present. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to everybody on this panel. I think they've quite brilliantly demonstrated the experience of the environment of hate and also how it operates, particularly when you mentioned how the media essentially creates that environment. As I was introduced, I'm from an organization called the Islamic Human Rights Commission. We're based in London, but we've done, part of our remit is to do research work, and we've been doing that for nearly 20 years now. Next year is our 20th anniversary. And I'm one of the co-authors of this book, conveniently titled, The Environment of Hate, the New Normal for Muslims in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we published this book, but also what our findings are, both in terms of data, but also what the environment of hate means, actually not just for Muslims, but for everybody. Now, first of all, and I think it came up in the workshop this morning, we argue that whilst obviously we've looked at the experience of Muslims, and there are very, very specific experiences, Islamophobic experiences of Muslims. You want to call it Islamophobia, if you prefer to call it anti-Muslim racism. I think at this point in time, it doesn't matter about the semantics. We all can kind of understand that there is an experience that those words describe. What we argue is that a combination, and it's been averred to by everybody on the panel here. I heard the word, this is the system in this country. Or, you know, as you've mentioned, these are the, you know, practices of the media and the politicians. That we have hate policies that are developed. We have political discourse, we have hate representation, whether that's by politicians or by the media. We have all of these issues now appearing also in our education system, and this is an institution that for a long time we often forget to talk about. So we talk about legal institutions and law enforcement, and we talk about political institutions. We tend to forget that education is a pillar as well of society and culture, and so on and so forth, and that there's a kind of symbiotic relationship. You know, they all feed into each other, these institutions. And when it comes to the issue of demonization, of which Islamophobia is one manifestation, these institutions all feed into each other. And I'll try and explain a little bit while I'm talking, but it's open in Q&A as well, for me to give more examples of how that works. Now, we argue that what we're facing now in 2016, this was published last year actually, but it's at the conclusion or at a midway point in a project that's been going on for a long time, is that we've seen a huge cultural, legal, and political shift in this country. It's not that we didn't have racism before or even anti-Muslim racism, but this shift has seen an institutionalization of that racism and a socialization of those racisms against Muslims in a way that isn't just devastatingly impactful on Muslim people or people who are perceived to be Muslim, and many, many people are mistaken to be Muslim. It's not just something that affects visibly Muslim people. And we've heard so many examples on the panel already, but actually it has started affecting everybody in different ways. And I'll give you our sort of summary of our few arguments with regard to that. So first of all, we're in a situation now where on the one hand, if you listen not only to the Daily Mail, which I think we can all agree in this room is quite a rabid publication, but if you want to listen to sort of The Guardian or, you know, what we would like to think are kind of allies in the media or even politicians and political circles, we all think that we've kind of defeated racism, 20 years ago with all our laws, Race Relations Act, Council for Racial Equality and all that stuff. So much so that actually we just live in a post-racial society now. So when we see Islamophobia or racism of any sort, it's perpetrated by some random individual who's got a problem, who's got prejudice, who's whatever, whether you think they're mentally ill or whether you just think they're, an out-and-out racist. It doesn't matter. It's just the problem of these individuals, okay? We don't question anymore, have we got bias still in our institutions? And ironically, I was sort of reviewing the literature, 20, 30, 40 years ago, you even had conservative peers of the realm writing reports post things like riots, actually saying, you know, actually we have a huge problem in this country with institutionalized prejudice. And others went even so far as to say institutional racism. We've completely lost that culture. And as a result of that, on the one hand, you've got the shifting of blame for racism onto individuals, but you've also got a kind of shifting of responsibility for tackling racism on people who are victims of racism. So you often hear this mantra of, well, you know, if you just show yourselves that you're not actually the stereotype that you're being portrayed to be, everybody will kind of understand, and then they won't, effectively the implication is you won't be attacked anymore. That shift of responsibility and that way of looking at, of moving the responsibility from institutions, whether it's the government, whether it's the Ministry of Education, whether it's a school, whether it's the Daily Mail, or whether it's all of the big media institutions, actually works on many, many levels. So we're seeing a shift again in, for example, the culture of violence against women. And if you monitor that, it's the same shift. The shift is going back onto responsibility women need to take for ensuring their own safety, rather than having, you know, a big shift in a culture that effectively, you know, largely validates violence against women. Moving on from that shift of responsibility also means that, okay, the shift goes on to individuals, but there's also a shift onto civil society. So NGOs, everybody else now has to start taking responsibility. Let's forget about prejudice. The way Islamophobia has sort of been instrumentalized in making Muslims responsible as individuals for different things, but also the organizations, for example, to condemn this, to root out terrorism, to be involved in prevent, and so on and so forth, now finds a mirror in trying to get civil society to actually take responsibility for things like poverty and food poverty. So all of a sudden now, or even health. So, you know, NGOs now must kind of go around training people to have better control of their health, therefore we don't put pressure on the NHS, this type of thing. You know, okay, 8 million people are living in food poverty in this country. We need more charities to set up food banks. This is how the narrative is working. So again, you've seen that through the use of a discourse like Islamophobia, we've actually managed to open up, well, actually not open up, close many responsibilities of the state and open up this kind of Pandora's box of problems for everybody else. It was mentioned in the workshop I was in this morning, but actually one of the facets of the environment of hate, and I think we're all familiar with it, and it's happened here with something as ridiculous as reading a book about Syrian culture, is that clamp down on freedom of speech, expression, belief. Now is obviously not the time to talk about, you know, the grey lines and whatever about it, but the actual overwhelming kind of attack on Muslims having critical views is now something that has affected and moved on to other dissenting voices. We heard about fracking. Any kind of anti-war voice, anti-foreign policy voice is now demonized in a similar way. And actually we saw with what happened to Joe Cox in its most extreme example to an individual, is somebody who is in fact the epitome of a kind of white middle class success story, actually being murdered as a race traitor, again, through these similar processes. And at the same time, this also validates the kind of so-called external adventures that the state undertakes, whether it's in Muslim countries or whether it's in other countries that it wants to be involved with, because that same process of dehumanization is working over and over again. And this undermines internal democracy, and it definitely undermines any attempt at external democracy as well. And there are other outcomes of this. I don't need to explain to anybody here that you know how demonization has worked in the media, or David Cameron's speeches, or Tony Blair's speeches, or even anybody else's speeches. But we have other agendas that have kind of quietly crept in and changed the nature of the state we're living in. So we actually have an internal militarization of, and I say this country advisedly because I know, of course, that you know we are different nations making up currently so-called United Kingdom, and the experiences will be different in different places, but as a policy that's been rolled out by central government, we have huge increase in both troops policing streets, and this is particularly evident if, like me, you're from London, where off of the excuses like a terrorist threat, you suddenly find that Wimbledon is no longer full of stewards but soldiers, and then off of the back of the Olympics, having lots of military on our streets which never really go away afterwards. You have the rolling out of cadet schools, and you have a huge shift in the narrative, especially in the last 10 years, into a kind of blind loyalty to not just the forces of this country, but any expedition they undertake. And there can be no criticism of that. And we see that in the sort of year-on-year now kind of attacks on anyone who doesn't wear a poppy, including, I saw, I forget the actress's name. It was just in a United Kingdom, the movie. Anyway, she was on a chat show without a poppy, as far as I can see, just because she didn't have space for it on her dress, and she said something like that afterwards, but yet she was kind of harangued on social media, and probably also in the Daily Mail, but I didn't pick it up, for again, being a traitor. And of course, ultimately, this leads to a backlash on the ground. Now, that backlash has a positive form and a negative form, so we see those negative mobilizations around the far right, who use this as a recruiting sergeant in a way that I grew up in the 70s and 80s and had to face quite direct physical violence from groups like the National Front, so did many of my friends. And to be honest, what we're seeing now we feel is worse in the last couple of years, because you never really had that many people mobilized, as you're kind of seeing now. But we also have, in this kind of moment of crisis upon crisis, other types of mobilization we're seeing, and I think this is my message when we're talking about the environment of hate, where people are beginning to see that this is a very toxic environment that we're living in, and that there is actually, it's now time to come together to do something. Now, what those things are many, and we've got further sessions to talk about this, but there is an opportunity here. It's not easy, and for some people it's even more dangerous, particularly Muslim and minority communities. And just to give you an example from, sorry, I have a few minutes? Couple of minutes. From the actual data collection that we did, just to highlight the kind of, if you like, acceleration into this environment. Now, I mean, brother at the end spoke about his experiences from 2001. Islamophobia predates that, state racism predates that, but we are seeing a downward spiral. And every time I think, we've reached a tipping point, or this is the worst it can get, it seems to get worse. And this last year with Brexit and with so many things, I think we're, in an even bigger crisis. When we wrote this is based on research we undertook in 2014. We published it in 2015. At that point, we said anti-Muslim racism has legitimized so many things that it only needs a little bit of a push, and then you're going to see immense violence and immense backlash, not just against Muslims or from Muslims, but many groups. And the run-up to and aftermath of Brexit, which we are still living in, it hasn't gone away, I think is a testimony to that. We've been collecting data using surveys rather than reporting for almost as long as the organization has been going on. And the reason we've done this is because, as was mentioned many times on here, people don't report hate crime. And to be honest, I don't blame people anymore for doing that either. Nothing comes out of it. You put yourself under intense scrutiny, and it can be as traumatic all over again. So we took the initiative to prepare surveys looking at not just your experiences of violence or hatred or being, called names, but how are you treated at school, in the workplace, what do you see on the media, etc., and ask people to respond to those. Now, we use this, as I said, it's been going on for many years, but we use the same set of questions for two particular periods, in 2010 and in 2014. And just to summarize, every single experience of 17 experiences we asked people about saw a deterioration, sometimes drastically so, in that 4-year period. There was only one category where people reported having less of an experience of this, and that was being stared at by strangers. Everything else, physical violence, up from about 12% to 18%. It doesn't sound huge, but out of a community of 3 million people, start thinking if that is representative, that's quite a few 100,000 people. Discrimination at school or negative experience at school and in the workplace doubled. So they went from around 20% to 45%, and so on and so forth. With regard to media, I'll just close up 90 seconds.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. With regard to media, back in 2010, and media was even then being highlighted as a huge problem, and I think it always has been, 60% of people said they saw some Islamophobia and racism in the media, but 40% said they hadn't seen anything, okay? This time, 90% of people, plus, actually, I can't remember the exact figure, said that they saw Islamophobia in the media. And 40% of the survey in total said we see it all the time in the media. Okay? That's a catastrophic collapse of not just the portrayal of Muslims, but the actual capacity of the media to be critical and self-reflecting. And it's a very scary place to be in. My colleague Reza Kazim, I'll finish on this, putting together, talking mainly about prevent actually, but pulling together all the strands of the things I've been talking about, because it's not just the policy of prevent or this anti-terrorism law or the British values agenda that's being brought into schools, largely off of the back of Trojan hoax, as we call it, but also through the anti-terrorism laws. He said the things that we are seeing now are things that people, at least of my age and probably older, would have said are how we would describe a Stasi state. So there are people in this room who are on the younger side. You're going to have to ask someone older what that means, okay? But it was a very negative conceptualization of particularly East Germany, but kind of Soviet countries. Whether it's true or not is a whole different conversation. But as Reza points out, and this is the point to sort of leave it at, is that even in those countries that were accused of having a Stasi state, there was a denial that such a thing existed or that such violations took place or that there were such policies or such ideologies. What we have in the United Kingdom at the moment, excuse me for using that phrase, it's not particularly united in any sense, is not just the operation of those things, not just the evidence that these things exist, but the fact that the state is not ashamed to say that these things exist, that it's actually become so normalized that it's seen as a good thing, whether it's anti-terrorism laws, whether it's prevent, whether it's the shifting of responsibility onto communities, whoever they are, and so on and so forth. And this, I think, is a thing we need to kind of mobilize around, to actually shift that culture and to make people understand that that culture has shifted to this, shifted to something completely to do with justice, and to mobilize around that. Thank you.